A devastating accident just occurred in Philadelphia where a flight was destined to pick up a young girl under 18 years old who just received life-saving treatment in Philadelphia. Unfortunately, as her plane went to take off to take her back to her home in Tijuana, Mexico, the plane crashed. In this video, and just a few hours after the accident, we're going to try to piece together how it's possible that a Learjet 55 was able to crash out of the sky almost like a missile and kill everyone on board and potentially even some on the ground. This is a devastating occurrence. It is terrible to see this event happen, and I feel so terrible for everybody who's lost loved ones involved. I want to say, I'm Meet Kevin. I'm a pilot. While I'm a newer pilot, I want to be clear. My goal every single day is to learn from any incident that occurs and share my experiences in my pilot journey. You can see more on my channel about that, but for now, we've got to look at ATC communications and what trajectory this plane was supposed to be on and what may have actually happened, because what the plane was told to do is not what the plane did, or should I say, the pilots. So let's try to piece together what happened here. What I'd like to do first is start with the air traffic control instructions, and then I'm going to compare those instructions to what actually happened. Take a look here. This is the air traffic control communication recording. Now, it sounds like you only get the tower frequency here, so you're not actually going to hear the pilots until they switch to the tower frequency. I'll explain that in a moment, but let's start with what the initial instructions were and then look at what they actually did.
Medevac, mid-service 056, on departure, turn right heading 290, runway 24, clear for takeoff, wind 25010.
First things first, the winds are 250 at 10 knots. This means they have almost a perfect headwind, and for a Learjet, 10 knots of winds at a 10-degree offset is essentially a non-issue. There was no mention of gusting winds, so I don't think winds were an issue here. It's a rainy night, this is nighttime, with low cloud coverage, and I think that may end up making a factor here, or playing a factor here. Now keep in mind, they were just cleared for takeoff from runway 24, and they were instructed on takeoff after they've reached the end of the runway. Typically, this is when the FAA expects you to initiate your turn. They were asked to turn right, heading 290. Is that what the plane did? Well, you're going to see. First, this is for flight, and it'll show you an overview of runway 24. Here is runway 24 at the Northeast Philadelphia Airport. If we draw an extending ruler from the center line of the runway, you can see it lines up perfectly with 240 degrees. Now, why does that matter? Because if I extend straight down the runway heading and I hold that 240, look at where this ruler intersects the freeway. It intersects right about where these trees are at a straight heading. Notice this right here, in this area where the bend is of the freeway and approximately where those trees sit. This will be very important, so keep this in mind. But first, I want you to see what a 290 heading actually looks like. 290 off of takeoff would have looked something like this. This heading is set for 290. So if you took off, we'll go ahead and use a different color here just so we could see this potentially a little bit more clearly. We'll go with a green thicker line here. If you made it to the end of the runway, you would have been expected to start your turn at the end of the runway in a heading of 290. But that's not what happened here. Remember, if they ended up going straight, you would expect that the plane would intersect right about here where this green circle is, right? Let's go ahead and take a look at the publicly available tracking data for tail number X-Ray Alpha Uniform Charlie India. Keep in mind, when a tail number starts with November, it's usually a US registration, and when it starts with X-ray Alpha, it's generally a Mexican registration, which this indeed was. In fact, all the passengers on board of this sponsored flight with a medical transport company were sponsored. Now, in other words, the life-saving treatment was sponsored, so this was sort of like a Make-A-Wish or a charity, right? The FAA has also confirmed that 6 people were on board: a mother, the daughter who received the treatment, 2 pilots, and 2 crew members. It is expected that all of them lost their lives as this crash impacted near a mall in Philadelphia. But let's take a look at that publicly available flight data. So what do we have on flight data here? Well, you can see here is the runway where my mouse is. And when we extend from this runway, what do you notice? The plane is right there where the trees are at the bend in the highway. And it's actually on a track of 240 degrees. Now, this doesn't tell us the direction of the nose at the time, but it does tell us that the plane itself was moving at a direction of about 240 degrees, which is roughly runway heading. It means they have not started their right turn yet, and they're already at 1,300 feet. Now, at this point, you could see that the aircraft has climbed about 1,200 feet. We know this because the airport elevation here on ForeFlight is listed at 120 feet. So, after climbing about 1,200 feet, the plane has still not even to about 5 degrees started its turn. Now, that's odd. And given that in the air traffic controller comms, we hear an air traffic controller say turn right heading 290, and then affirm turn right heading 290, and it's the controller saying it twice, it makes me wonder, are the pilots distracted in the cockpit? Now, it doesn't sound like there's a lot of stress when we go through more of the data. So let's go ahead and play the rest of what we have here, which is an edited together version of what the tower frequency hears. I'll play it again from the beginning, and I'll interrupt just to say when I think there are pieces cut out.
Medevac, med service 056, on departure, turn right heading 290, runway 24, clear for takeoff, wind 25010.
Initial.
Medevac med service 056, affirmative. On departure, turn right heading 290, runway 24, clear for takeoff.
Now you might wonder, why didn't you hear the pilots there? Well, in my opinion, you didn't hear the pilots because they were likely transmitting on the ground frequency, and I believe that this recording is only of the tower frequency, not also of ground. So you could hear tower talking to both sides, but you can't hear what they're saying on ground, so we don't get their voices until they're actually airborne and they're asked to switch from the tower frequency to the departure frequency, which we'll hear in just a moment.
Medevac med service 056, contact Philly departure 123.8.
123.8, Mike Tango Sierra 056 Medevac. Thank you, good day.
Medevac med service 056, northeast tower, contact Philly 123.8.
123.8. They're saying this because they're asking that the pilots transfer over to contact the other frequency. Now, initially, when we heard the pilot, it didn't sound like there was any particular cockpit distress. In my opinion, the pilots may not have yet been distressed at the time that they've switched frequencies. In fact, I think this happened very suddenly to them. Well, what's about to happen. And I'll explain what my impression is, but we'll keep listening.
Medevac med service, northeast tower. Medevac med service 056, northeast tower. You on frequency?
Medevac Mike Tango Sierra 056, northeast tower. How do you hear this transmission?
Medevac med service 056, northeast tower.
At this point, it's likely that they've already switched frequencies. They're on with the other comms. They're not on with tower anymore. And unfortunately, the accident takes place. Now, what else can we glean from the publicly available data? Well, when we look at the rest of the public data, we could see that the plane never enters its right turn, ever. All we could see is that at 11:06 UTC, we have a plane that is still heading runway direction 1,200 feet after runway elevation. They haven't even begun their right turn. Now, the METAR we have at this moment, a couple hours afterwards, indicates broken clouds at 700 feet. It's possible that right as they entered this 1,300-foot height, they started to get disoriented in the clouds. And this can happen even to experienced instrument-rated pilots, especially if they're not familiar with the airport, they're not familiar with the area or the weather, and clearly at this point they've forgotten already to turn right. They might be overwhelmed with what's going on, especially if a passenger is potentially having issues in the back or somebody is talking to them and they don't actually have a sterile cockpit. Unfortunately, we're unlikely to know what happened on the inside because there's unlikely to be a voice data recorder or cockpit recorder on this small of a jet. However, I can tell you that when you enter clouds, even as an instrument-rated pilot, it can be a moment of adjustment or call for a moment of adjustment. I was just flying a multi-engine plane yesterday, and the feeling of transitioning from I can see the horizon to, wow, I'm looking at a wall of clouds, and the clouds are the same color as the water under me. I was flying at around 4 p.m., and we had such an overcast day that everything looked like I was looking into a seamless on a studio set, as in there was no horizon anymore. It can take a moment to adjust and look, okay, let's get into instrument mode, look down, how's my altitude, how's my airspeed, and how is my heading? We already know that they've lost sight of their heading because they never initiated their turn. The only thing that's next to make a big oopsie when you start getting into the clouds is you accidentally pitch the nose up too high, especially if you're loaded to the rear. Now, when people hear jets, we regularly think that jets are extremely powerful. But as a jet owner myself, somebody who owns a slightly smaller than the Learjet 55, but a Phenom 300E, I can tell you the loading weight of these jets isn't as much as you think, especially if you have full fuel, because you're trying to get from Philadelphia all the way to Tijuana, Mexico, and you're going to be against the jet stream. You're probably trying to make it without stops, so you've probably filled this to the brim. If you filled this plane to the brim, you're going to have a useful load of about 1,800 to 2,200 pounds. That's not a lot. If you have 6 people on board, let's put an average weight for each person. Yes, the person under 18 was presumably under 200 pounds, but we don't know the weight of the pilots. So let's use an average weight per person of 200 pounds. Now we already have 1,200 pounds gone. But now we have to add medical equipment, possible IV equipment. We saw oxygen tanks in the debris field. There is a lot more weight on this plane than is probably typical, in addition to any kind of baggage that the mother and daughter potentially brought, or souvenirs or gifts that they got for succeeding in their treatment. I hate to say it, but I think there's a high likelihood that as the pilots entered the clouds, they unfortunately had a plane that was fully loaded, aft heavy, and they, before they could even realize it, had pitched the plane up slightly too high, and the plane entered a right spin stall. That's my opinion as somebody who's still advancing in their flight training, and I'm a newer pilot, so I want to be clear about that. But looking at this data, this is exactly what we're trained for to try to avoid. The best stall is no stall. And let's look at this data here together to see if this would make logical sense. We're at 1,300 feet at a ground speed of 187 knots. Now, if we expect an engine failure, we would expect that this ground speed would rapidly decline before our vertical speed declines. If our vertical speed rapidly declines, it potentially indicates a stall. Now, in case you've never been in a stall, when you get your private pilot license, you actually, in order to pass, you have to go on a check ride with a designated pilot examiner. They're authorized by the FAA to do this. I had my check ride not that long ago. And I had to show her a full stall, brake, and recovery in a single engine prop plane. And in a single engine prop plane, essentially you get into this would be like a power on stall, we would call it, where you're in a takeoff configuration. And in order to show them a power on stall, you have to pitch the nose back, pull it towards you essentially. So you're pulling on the elevator. You're pitching up, until it breaks. And in a single engine prop, you can recover from this. So you'll actually give the examiner a full brake on a single engine plane. And what that feels like is you'll slowly up, stick shaker activates if you have one, stall, warning. When it breaks, it's not a slow brake. A brake like a stall will be something like whoosh. It's fast. And it is really difficult to recover from a stall if you're rearward loaded. And that is my assumption of what happened here. Baggage, the staff, and the patient, the mother. Anyway, in a single engine plane, you can recover from this. In a multi-engine plane, going through multi-engine training and jet training, it's almost impossible to recover from these situations. In fact, when we train them, we never go into actual stalls in a multi-engine situation because they're so dangerous and deadly. They're almost unrecoverable. And I think that's why in footage, when we see the plane come down like a missile, it's frankly because they stalled and there was nothing to get them to recover. Now let's look at the data to see if the data corroborates this thesis. Again, we've got 1,300 feet of elevation, 187 knots of ground speed, vertical speed of 3,000, which is actually acceptable for a Learjet. It's fast. It's acceptable for a Learjet, though. The very next ping that we have, let's go ahead and reset the zoom there. There we go. The very next data point that we have is actually a vertical speed that has declined to 1,472 feet per minute. Now, this is really interesting because you're going 187 knots and you did speed up by about 11 knots. So you sped up 11 knots and your vertical speed decelerated. That would actually indicate an initial sort of pointing the nose down a little bit, unless this is the early portion of the stall. And unfortunately, that's what I think happened here. This is the moment of the stall. We gain speed because all of a sudden we're going from rising or climbing at 3,000 feet per minute. In the very next snapshot, which frankly is a distance of less than 5 seconds, right here, 38 on the second counter here to 35. So we're talking 7 seconds, I should say. In 7 seconds, we go from climbing at 3,000 feet to climbing half of the rate, and then just 2 seconds later, when we get the 3 seconds later, when we get the next data point, we go from 1,400 feet per minute to 400 feet per minute, and our ground speed is picking up. And the very next data point, which is just 2 seconds later, we're at roughly the same feet per minute here, picked up a little bit on ground speed. Next data point is 4 seconds later, same spot. And within the next 5 seconds thereafter, we go from climbing at 448 feet to now falling at 2,800 feet per minute. So in other words, in the span of 20 seconds, we went from climbing 3,000 feet a minute, which is a steep climb, especially if you're fully loaded, to falling 2,000 feet per minute. That is not, to me, the sign of an engine failure. Engines fail at a rate of 1 every 240,000 flight hours for a turbine. It's very rare, and multi-engine pilots are trained to overcome an engine failure, even on takeoff. It hurts your leg because it takes a lot of rudder work, but this is a solvable issue. I think these pilots were so unfamiliar, they got themselves into the clouds, they got confused, possibly looked at each other for a moment and said, hey, what was the heading we were supposed to fly again? As they're in the clouds, they lost sight of the horizon. They didn't look at their instruments for the attitude or their pitch angle. And unfortunately, they exceeded the critical angle of attack and left the plane no choice but to stall. Now, I want to be clear. I don't know if this is with certainty what happened. And it might be a very long time for any of us to get all of the answers or all of the details of what actually happened. On screen, you could see some of the details or some of the debris that we see on the floor here. This is a devastating situation to see a medical plane with a pediatric patient crash, and some of the scenes are frankly heartbreaking. My purpose in going through some of the data we have here is really just to show you
Plane just fucking crashed.
Okay, well, I wasn't expecting the audio to turn on that one, but anyway. It's really to show you how quickly aviation can go from everything is fine to everything is poopy doopy. Now, I personally really respect Pilot Debrief, and I look forward to his debrief on what happened in this situation, mostly because I believe that he's the reason I got into aviation. While I was looking and watching his videos, I got inspired to see, can I do what's necessary to fly safely? Can I challenge myself and become a safe pilot? And I study aviation on almost a daily basis, and seeing cases like this absolutely breaks my heart. But I think there's a learning experience in every single accident that happens, including the helicopter crash that we talked about, the Black Hawk that crashed into the American Airlines flight, and my experiences with trainers who are, quite frankly, often still learning themselves. You can see my video on that. There are some recommendations I have for that as well. To looking at this and seeing in bad weather, going into the clouds, what happens when you're potentially overloaded, distracted, not able to hold the heading that you're instructed to do or instructed to fly, and before you know it, you exceed the critical angle of attack for this plane. Now, there are other people who have indicated that potentially this plane was on a go-around. I've seen some posts of individuals suggesting the plane had actually potentially landed and then it was on a go-around. That doesn't corroborate or line up with the ATC data, and it doesn't line up with the ADS-B data either, mostly because we could see here that the flight or the plane came from Miami and landed in Philadelphia at around 12:30 p.m. on a scheduled slot, but it actually ended up arriving at 3:09. And then we have what looks like a flight plan that is filed for a 5 p.m. departure, but then we have the actual flight, which occurs right here, which is different from what's filed in the flight plan. It is the flight when they take off. And as we could see in the data here, this is not a continuation or a go-around, which would typically be indicated by ADS-B data indicating what looks like a fly over the airport and a continuation. It's possible. It doesn't seem like that's what's happening here in the data, given the time difference between this prior flight and what we see in this data. See, this is 5 p.m. UTC when they landed in Philadelphia, and they were going to Philadelphia to pick up a pediatric patient. So while there are some images circling around over, oh, could this have been a go-around? I think that's highly unlikely. For example, I see this image or tweet right here. Oh, was this a go-around? I don't think so. In fact, to me, this is just a normal takeoff pattern, and this is an interesting 3D visualization of the direction of their flight. As you can see, there's really at no point a right turn here. There's only a left turn stall, which is, again, extremely devastating, and it's just terrible to see. Again, the FAA has verified that there were 6 people on board. You can see some more footage here of the early scene of what this looked like. There are houses on fire. There are officers here responding clearly on the phone. Actually, one of those individuals looks like a police explorer. I used to be a police explorer. And clearly a devastating situation given that this plane was expectedly full of fuel to make the flight to Tijuana. Keep in mind also that smaller jets, like for example, a Cirrus single-engine jet, if you fill that jet up with fuel all the way, you could barely put 2 people on it with full fuel and get anywhere. The loading capacity of smaller jets isn't that great, so you have to be really, really careful, especially when you're in the elements and if you're in unfamiliar terrain. It's really scary, and I highly encourage that when pilots are flying in new areas, they don't ever make flights in new areas in situations where they have passengers, where they're likely to be stressed, or at the very least, pre-fly it. Flight simulate the flight first. Do whatever you can do to become familiar with the area and brief your takeoff instructions. One thing that I like to do, and this is what I'll leave it off at, is when I take off, when I'm at the hold short line, I always triple check that I have my heading set on my autopilot. And when I have my heading and my flight level set, I can't exceed the critical angle of attack because I've set a climb rate that is well below the critical angle of attack, even fully loaded. Beyond that, I also have my heading set. That way, not only do I have the autopilot set, which I don't turn on yet until I've taken off, and I'm usually at about 400 to 600 feet, but I'm mentally prepped. Turn right heading 290, turn right heading 290. Got it. Now, I have that in my mind, so when I get to the end of the runway on my takeoff and I'm between 400 feet and 1,000 feet, I can hit the autopilot, and the autopilot is going to take me through those clouds at a safe climb rate and in the heading and direction that I'm supposed to be flying. There's a lot that's going on, including frequency changes. You're going into the clouds, you're adjusting to your instruments, you're at night, you're in an unfamiliar territory. Anything you could do to reduce your workload is a great choice. Clearly in this case, the autopilot was not set, otherwise they would have made that right turn heading. Maybe they were fidgeting and trying to set the autopilot. Obviously, this is speculation at this point. All we know is we've had a tragic disaster here, again, just days after the American Airlines crash into the Potomac. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.
Why not advertise these things that you told us here? I feel like nobody else knows about this.
We'll try a little advertising and see how it goes.
Congratulations, man. You have done so much. People love you. People look up to you.
Kevin Paffrath there, financial analyst and YouTuber. Meet Kevin. Always great to get your take.